He's a professor at the University of Alberta and chair of the Department of Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. After a 10-year stint in the Canadian Forestry Service, he joined REIS in 2007 with teaching and research interests in rural and environmental sociology. John's recent work on forest topics include a national survey of public advisory committees in forest management and research with David Anderson from FRI Research. His paper will give us the community perspective of wood supply, and the title of the talk is Sustaining Timber, Sustaining Rural Communities, Shared Destiny or Separate Paths. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Vic. Can you see my presentation?
And indeed.
Okay, thanks. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to sharing some thoughts with you today. I'll keep it to 10 minutes for sure. My background is in environmental sociology. Some of you may know I started my career at the Canadian Forest Service, so I worked for the CFS for 10 years before joining the University of Alberta, and my entire focus of that early part of my career was on forest communities and forest community sustainability. So I've been working on these topics and thinking about these issues for a long time. If we go back to the idea of sort of a sustained yield forestry policy coming out of the post-war era, after World War II, part of that sustained yield policy was focused on trying to sustain or to stabilize communities in North America, and so stability was seen as a goal because of the kind of the constant boom and bust cycle of commodity industries, and sustained yield was thought to be a part of the solution to stabilize communities, and so community stability was really the key concept for a long time in the context of community development, and so stability was a focus even when I started at the Canadian Forest Service. Some of the government documents were still talking about the idea of community stability. So I guess the short story here is the take-home message is that I think it's quite clear that we cannot think about community stability in that way, in the same way that we cannot think about equilibrium ecology, right? So we've moved beyond the notion of sort of stable states and equilibriums to dynamic states, dynamic systems, and non-equilibrium ecosystems. And so it's the same within the social sciences and within our thoughts around communities and sustainable communities. We're really no longer talking about stability, we're talking about something else. So that's sort of the backstory to what I'm presenting today. So I'm just going to show you a series of slides which sort of try to drive home the point. And perhaps I'm being slightly over provocative, but I want to sort of make a point fairly clearly and use that as a to the discussion later this morning. So if we look at forestry, we've seen a lot of numbers and trends and data, but a couple of slides here from the State of the Forest report. These trends are pretty consistent. An upward movement in terms of forest product exports ever since the sort of the market crash around 2008. So for the last decade, we've seen improvements in forest product exports from Canada. You can also see financial performance of the forest industry is very good and improving over time. So if you look at some of these metrics, you might think, well, forest sustainability is on a fairly good path. And if you look at the economic, performance measures like these, it looks like a pretty good story. Although we can see from the previous presentations today that, if you look at the forest yield side or the sort of the forest health side, there's obviously some serious problems. But looking at industry performance in these metrics, it looks quite good. So that's part of the story. And part of that story historically has been the way in which that forest industry has supported forest communities. So this is a map that we generated while I was at the Canadian Forest Service. looking at the Boreal region in particular, and the red dots represent all of the communities across that Canadian landscape that are supported by the forest industry. And at the time I was working on these maps, we had upwards of 400 communities that were dependent on the forest sector. Vic Liefers noted at the beginning of our talk this morning, it was upwards of 600 communities that are dependent on the forest sector. The latest State of the Forest report says that we have 300 communities that are dependent on the forest sector. So in some ways, it really depends on how you're defining dependency and what we mean by a forest-based community. But nonetheless, there's been this focus on forests as a part of sustainable forest, a focus on communities as a part of sustainable forest management for a long time. And in fact, the idea of community sustainability is kind of baked into the way that we define sustainable forest management in Canada. So if you look at the CCFM criterion indicators of sustainable forest management, criteria 6.3 is about forest community well-being and resilience. So we're interested in forest communities as a component of sustainable forest management in Canada. But we can see then also from the data, and I'm taking these data from a Statistics Canada report that was released a couple of years ago, over the last 15 years, there's been a remarkable drop in the number of forest-based communities within Canada. So the numbers here suggest, precipitous decline, particularly in the smaller communities. So the lighter bar represents the number of communities in 2001, and the darker bar represents the number of communities in 2016. So we can see a pretty dramatic drop in the number of forest-based communities as measured by the percentage of people in those communities who are dependent for income from forestry. There's another slide that shows from 2001, 463 communities down to 105 communities in 2016. So that's really kind of the story that I wanted to share with you today, is that if you're looking at this indicator of sustainable forest management, it's clearly going in the wrong direction. And so my provocative argument is that what I see or observe is a delinking of industry and community. Historically, the fortunes of industry were pretty closely tied to the fortunes of rural communities because industry needed a large pool of labor. They needed a large labor force. But clearly, there's a huge decline in employment opportunities across the forest sector, from harvesting to processing and so on. We know the reasons why. Industry needs to maintain competitiveness. They employ labor shedding technologies. They're focused on efficiencies and so on. In contrast, communities need jobs. Communities are focused on employment opportunities, local livelihoods, local businesses, and so on. And so the objectives of forest companies, forest industries, are often not in line with the objectives and goals of forest communities. So we're seeing this play out across the country. So the question then would be, are there any solutions? And of course, there are no easy answers, just like there are no easy answers on the sort of the biophysical or ecosystem side of the equation. There are no easy answers on the social science, on the social side of the equation. We see this problem in the forest sector around labor shedding technologies and decline in rural communities, but we also see it in other sectors, energy, agriculture, and so on. So, what do we do about this? What are the ways to move forward? How do we think about some pathways forward? And here, I think there may be some opportunities to really think more clearly, more deeply about what we mean by a resilient community, right? So you're talking about resilience on the forest ecosystem side, but there is also a parallel concept of community resilience on the social science side. So how can the forest sector contribute to forest community resilience in meaningful ways? I think that's one of the ways we can think about a path forward. Another path forward might be around governance and tenure models. And one of the examples that comes to mind for me is in BC with forest communities. Community forest models are fairly extensive on the BC landscape, not so much in other parts of Canada. But is there scope for alternative tenures, and could alternative tenures be a way to link the concept of, forest industry development with community development in a more meaningful way? So I'll leave it at that. Basically out of time, stuck within my 10 minutes, but I look forward to continuing on this conversation within the groups.